Let's continue now. Thank you. Great. Okay, perfect. We'll just continue as we're going. So I'm really pleased to be here. It's a great privilege and a great honor to be able to address Cambridge alumni. As Gabrielle said, I did my PhD in the engineering department at Wolfson College. I'll talk about more about what I've done since then. It was about 32 years ago. What am I doing now? We're going to talk about AI and the brain and my adventures over the last 30 years since I did my work in the engineering department on speech recognition. So I'm president of R42. What is R42? 42 is named after Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which refers to trying to find the answer to a number of questions. But the only problem is we need to find out what the question is. But I look at like deep science, AI, biotech companies, and we do a lot of talks and a lot of informing, many of which are free, a few some nominal fees, run an accelerator and the like. And there's a summer program starting tomorrow. My first adventures were actually before Cambridge, working with Apricot that did speech recognition in laptops, did a lot of work in China, did Chinese handwriting recognition, worked on the first mobile app stores, and worked on handwriting recognition. Where did I get my inspiration from? It was actually from Star Trek. I know we've got a lot of different ages and different audiences here, so I have to be careful about which generation of Star Trek I'm talking about. I'm talking about the original Star Trek with William Shatner, and then the next generation. And most of the things in Star Trek have actually been done. The mobile phone, the communicator, we've got the iPad, and we've got the tricorder, which is even being tried. You know, people have sort of worked on that, where you just scan something over somebody's body and see what they're doing. It's a and the like. So somebody just said they can't hear the audio, but I hope it's just Glenn. Yes, I think most people are hearing the audio. It's probably you, just Glenn. Thank you. And yes, automatic doors. Thank you very much. Just simple things like that. But one thing that has not been done yet is Data, the android, who was forever thinking whether he was a machine or could he ever be human? Not a new concept. So we have that from Pinocchio from decades before. My own starting point was trying to do spoken digit recognition. Again, this is just before Cambridge at Birmingham University, but probably got me into Cambridge, where you could speak telephone digits continuously. Before you had to have a pause in between each word. And my innovation was where you could slide the words together, elide them with no pauses. And looking here, doing a lot of wiring, is doing a lot of electrical engineering, but we're looking at like 1 megahertz, not 1 gigahertz processing power, and 8 kilobytes, not megabytes or gigabytes, really quite small. So we'd like 100,000 times more computing power. This is Apricot, the first laptop with speech recognition. Again, we couldn't do full-blown speech recognition like we do now, but we could only do a few thousand words and a maximum, only groups of 64 words at a time. But this is 1984, and people would fall off their chair when a demonstration was given. After Cambridge, went to MIT, went to Stanford, working in the psychology department, and started my first company. Was working on a handwriting recognition, just like the speech recognition problem. We try and figure out where one letter began and one letter ended. Was quite a difficult problem. It was a so-called cursive problem, and still quite a difficult problem even today, but this was done in 1991. And basically got on the cover of Fortune magazine, which is a business magazine here in the States. And the head of the title of the article was Computers That Mimic the Brain. So even in 1993, we were talking about this, and we're still talking about it. You could probably publish the same article today. It talks about neural networks that can solve stock market prediction and robotics and speech recognition and handwriting recognition. 3 months later, after appearing on this, Motorola bought the company. We were only 3 people, actually. I think they thought we were bigger than that. We can talk about some of the entrepreneurial aspects, and spent many years at Motorola working on the first speech recognition phones and the first handwriting recognition phones, and many of the phones with the first apps on phones. And this was earlier than you might think. The first app phones were actually really in the late 90s, not the late 2000s. And so what is intelligence? We're talking about artificial intelligence. Let's talk about what intelligence is, first of all. Intelligence was asked, this question was asked to about 100 academics about 30 years ago by the Wall Street Journal. And these were the answers in sort of a sort of ability to reason and solve, think abstractly. It's not book learning or test taking, sort of figuring out, catching on, making sense of what to do, really thinking about self-awareness. These are things that came out of it. About half the researchers replied. And so what is artificial intelligence? The artificial intelligence we see out there today is usually not that. They're usually very vertical problems. These are the robot grass cutter. Siri can actually answer your questions, but it can't predict the stock market. It can't recognize your fingerprint. Those are separate systems. And so we have many definitions of what artificial intelligence is. The original definition, actually, by the original definition, most of what we see today is not AI. The original definition is to provide human-like intelligent functions. This is like human performance. And this leads on to generalized artificial intelligence, where human performance, where we can learn something and take those learnings to solve some other problem. And so usually the systems we see in the wild, in the field, cannot do that. They can only solve one problem. In the last 20, 30 years, and really starting from my PhD at Cambridge, a lot of the work was done in like sort of the late 80s. There was a shift in moving to collect statistics on data. Some of these problems were so difficult, like speech recognition and handwriting recognition. The previous methodology was to use what was called symbolic processing, so-called GOFI, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, where the problem was how do we get the rules to solve a problem and encode those rules in a machine. And a huge infrastructure was developed, new computer languages like Prolog and Lisp, and new machines were created to really be optimized to deal with many, many different rules. But what we found was many problems, we actually didn't know what the rules were. Despite trying very hard, we didn't actually know what the rules are. We didn't actually know how to solve spoken word recognition, because everybody had different accents. Everybody spoke different ways and with different idioms, depending on how, what region of the country or what region of the world they would come from, even if it was the same language. And so the last 30 years, we've been learning using data. And there really is two types of learning. One is supervised learning, where we have data that is already labeled. So we maybe get handwritten signals, characters, which are labeled by humans, where we sit down and label each character. And then we create a model for each character. And then when we see a new character, we find the nearest model to that character and say that's the prediction. So that's what's called supervised learning. You also have unsupervised learning, where we don't actually have labeled data. The data is actually clustered using a number of techniques. Some people may be familiar with some of these statistical techniques like principal component analysis or vector quantization, which is what I did. And an example might be taking a set of movies and TV shows, and we know the actors and we know where the actors lived, and we know where the TV shows were played and when they were played. And we take all these features and we would cluster them. And then after the fact, we would give labels to these clusters. So we've got classic comedians and we've got American TV shows here. And we do this quite well as humans. And, many of us in marketing, and we try and create market segments for the different segments that would actually create, we actually see in the marketplace and label those. But if we can do this mathematically, we can find by using distance measures how close each element is and create clusters. And today's field, unlike when I was at Cambridge, where really it was most of the work was done mainly in the engineering department. The engineering department historically took the lead on statistical techniques, and the computer lab was more on the symbolic processing. Now, many of people are using these so-called deep learning techniques, these statistical methods for many things. But now we see other disciplines, and certainly most universities I'm seeing now, it's not just the engineering department, the computer science department, or the mathematics department. We're seeing it in the psychology department. In fact, when I went to Stanford, I joined not the engineering department or the computer science department, but I joined the psychology department, trying to figure out the mathematics of how the human brain worked, working with Professor Rummelhart, who actually tried to figure out the parameters of a neural network. One department we're not seeing here is philosophy. Also, in many universities, I see the law department, people looking at the ethics of how you can use these systems. As we're getting more and more examples where we're sort of bumping into the challenges of using automated systems, but also looking at the rights of society. We've also even seen a lot of hype. This is Sophia. Sophia was given citizenship. I'll let you guess which country it was. It was actually given citizenship from the country of Saudi Arabia. Most people in the computer science fraternity are not particularly impressed in Sophia as an example of AI. Many of the demonstrations are canned. You can ask Sophia some questions that are usually they're very, very simple questions. They're just grabbing keywords. We can, by the way, you don't have to take screenshots of these slides. I'll arrange for you to get these slides somehow. You either send me an email or Cambridge America will send them to you if you request them. So I've talked about neural networks. What are neural networks? These are now really extremely popular technique in artificial intelligence. Why? Now we have a lot more data. We have a lot more computing power. We also have tweaks. We have the basic technique is the same as the technique was when I was working on these things at Cambridge 30 years ago, but we have a lot more tweaks on how to improve the systems. And I'll give you an example of what this kind of thing could do. This is quite an old demonstration now, but we can look at, this is by DeepMind, and we'll give a demonstration of what this could do. This is playing Atari Breakout, and all it's being given here are the pixels of the problem. And this is a little computer game, sometimes called Brick Breaker on a BlackBerry. And all it's given is the pixels and the score of the problem. And it starts out, and also the ability to know what it can do, which is like move left or right, or at the beginning you can just fire. So after 10 minutes of training, it sort of like gets a rough idea of what to do, but it's not scoring that high. And it's just simply giving it's playing the game, and not too bad, but we're making some progress. And then after a couple of hours, it's doing really well. So let's see what it's doing. Yeah, now it's really doing well. Now it's really figured out the score's going higher and higher. It's really catching the ball every time and doing really well. And then after about 4 hours of training, it does really, really well. And this is figures out a technique that to make the score go exponential, which many of us as humans might have not figured out. And let's see what that looks like. So it figures out that if you can get the ball behind the wall, then the score goes through the roof. Okay, right, that was fun. So after that demonstration, that company, DeepMind, was bought for $550 million. And it is, let me see, let me go back to our, there we go. And Right, so there we go. So the other poster child is the game of Go. I'm not sure how many of you play Go, but this is an impressive feat. We had a computer actually beat the grandmaster at Go. Go, unlike chess, you can figure out every single combination of every move for the next 14 moves and decide your best strategy. If you tried that with Go, there are more combinations than there are atoms in the universe, so it's a very difficult problem. So it's amazing. Humans do a pretty good job despite that. And yet we had a machine that was able to beat a human. Now let's look at what the human, now we're talking about the brain and we're talking about the machines, what we're up against. So the machine that was actually being run there was running at about 12 to the 10 to the 5 times 10 to the 15 flops. Flops are floating point operations per second. So that's how we measure computing power. The floating point means like it's a floating point number. And it runs about 10 to the 16 flops. And what do humans run out? You can think about, well, we run out around about 0.01 flops. And, because we've got a Cambridge crowd here, we can probably compute, the addition of floating point numbers quicker than 100 seconds, but order of magnitude, it'll take us a minute or two to compute, add up two floating point numbers. The brain has 100 billion neurons, but what's amazing, the brain only runs on 20 watts of power, unlike 20 servers that the machine played against the human. And so instead of 20 kilowatts, we run at 20 watts. Smartphones are running about 10 to the 12. People think that to replicate human processing might be 10 to the 18. So it's 1,000 of what we've got right now. TPUs, these tensor processing units that Google have made. So we're not too far away, but as my professor at Cambridge, Professor Falside, now passed away, unfortunately, used to say, well, what would happen if we get more processing power? We might just get the same wrong answer quicker. So it's not just processing power. And so what is the inspiration from the brain? So the brain's got 100 billion neurons, and this is what a neuron is. And these neurons are connected to each other, and each neuron has impulses from all the other neurons connected to it. So maybe there's a few hundred or a few thousand neurons connected to it. If the impulses get big enough, it'll send an impulse to other neurons, a few hundred or a few thousand neurons, and it will be mediated as it's sent to the other neurons. So we can develop this as a mathematical model where we have inputs. We weight each input. What are these inputs? They could be the pixels of a computer game or stock market prices, or it could be sound values. We weight the inputs and we add them up, and then we put them through a function. The function says, if it gets high enough, send it on. If it's not high enough, don't send it on, or even make it negative when you send it on. And so this is a very old concept. We have in the brain, lots of neurons connected to each other in networks. And this concept of the individual mathematical model of a single neuron comes from the 1950s by Rosenblatt. And the New York Times, even in those days, and this is what's common in the field, always says it's like 5 years away. They said 5 years away we'll have a computer that can walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. So that was in 1958. We're still waiting for some of these things, at least. Again, mathematically, we create a great simplification to the real brain. We arrange these mathematical nodes in layers, and we have to compute the weights from as one node sends signals onto subsequent nodes in subsequent layers. And it turns out if you have at least one middle layer, we can solve difficult, complex problems. And now we have like hundreds of layers quite often. A lot of the research is how to bring that back down to a few layers. But if you have at least one middle layer, we can solve what's known as nonlinear problems. These are problems that can not be solved by a straight line, things that are very, very much more complex. And so how similar is the mathematical model to a real neuron? Well, first of all, our neurons in the brain are very slow. We have to react. They react to the tune of around about 50 milliseconds. And computerized neurons work really fast, much, much faster. But secondly, in the brain, we've got 100 billion neurons. In computerized models, typically there are thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, but definitely not billions. The other thing in the brain, each neuron acts asynchronously. They can spike at different times, whereas in computer, it's basically run by the clock of the CPU. And we've already talked about the power consumption, how efficient the brain is in the human body. And by the way, even though we're efficient at 20 watts, it's about 20% of our total metabolism. And when we start doing complicated networks, there are many sort of complicated networks are popping up. This is a convolutional neural network. And this can solve what's called the ImageNet problem, where we try to find out a description of what's inside a picture. And we can see these examples are not too bad. And some of the top ones are quite good. Some of the bottom ones, maybe we might have said dog for this one instead of cherries, or car instead of this one for instead of grill. And we can also be creative. These are things called generative adversarial networks, where we're trying to say, let's, instead of detect a character, can we write a character? So we can actually, like, we have two networks fighting with each other. We have one network generating what a character is. So we start off with noise, and at the beginning it's rubbish. But this network says, well, is this generated character different to what could be in a training set? And at the beginning it's really easy, but we keep perturbing it. And eventually we get something that's quite close to it. And we say, okay, we can't actually tell the difference. So this is how a network can be creative in some sense. And I had a student, Robbie Barrett, very young guy, about 18 years old, who trained this on 16,000 landscapes by different artists, and tried to create a painting, trained this over, started off with noise, and tried to create a painting eventually where the network couldn't tell whether it was a real painting, a candidate painting or not. And you could argue whether this is really being creative, or is it taking parameters of the underlying training set, and parameters from Renoir and Van Gogh and Gauguin, where really we're building up on his, can we actually create anything truly revolutionary? But then you go back to humans, and can we actually create anything truly revolutionary? So, okay, let's talk about the humans. What is intelligence in the human? What is it like to be a human? This is a project I'm working on at Stanford University, looking at intelligence in humans, animals, and machines. As machines get cleverer, when do we sort of intersect where we think, well, actually, is the machine so clever? Could it be human? So going back to humans, how do we learn? You can think about toddlers. When the babies are born, maybe they start off with unsupervised learning, where nothing's labeled. They're trying to make sense of the world. As they start getting a few months older, toddler level, there maybe more supervised learning comes into effect, where their parents are labeling things and telling them what's what. Of course, many of these techniques that are current now, though, we have to learn from millions of examples. And as humans, often we don't. We can look at something once and we've learned it. So we might have to go back to sort of Bayesian systems, which can train on fewer examples to come back with what we really mean as learning. The other things that we do as humans, we have cultural learning. We learn from generation to generation. We're very skilled at transmitting rules and laws. We have culture that goes from generation to generation. And so we're transmitting information, intelligence, not just through our genetic characteristics, but also culture. And many people have said that's uniquely advantageous to humans. Other people have said, well, other creatures do it as well. Chimpanzees, their communities, dolphins have dialects, homing pigeons will have their preferred routes that pass from generation to generation. So it's not just humans. We do it digitally now. We now have hard drives. We have the web. It's now accelerating at a bigger pace. We can store more information. We have these higher order concepts of right and wrong. Often these concepts are in conflict with the objective function, the mathematical objective function of actually surviving for ourselves when we do behave altruistically. Or are we really? Is it the selfish gene that's really there? Other people have thought, well, you can't really just have a brain by itself. It has to be connected to something. It's connected to the rest of the body. It's connected to the environment. It's called so-called embodied cognition. And the other myth to dispel is we do not have the biggest brains. The elephant has a bigger brain than us. The whale has a bigger brain than us. However, we have the densest brain in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for learning, language, problem solving. And if we look at primates, non-primates, we're off the charts compared to other creatures. So even though an elephant has 250 billion neurons versus our 100, they have far fewer in the prefrontal cortex. And brains in general are very robust. They're fault tolerant. Despite having debilitating brain diseases, they still work. We can still breathe. We can still eat. We can still drink. Many parts of the mathematical model, as we said, it may not be exactly as plausible in the Bible. We haven't found those similar models in mathematics, but there's a big effort to try and figure out what we learn in computers. Can we apply it to what we learn in humans and vice versa to learn? We're seeing, this is Kevin Warwick for the last few decades. He's currently at Coventry University. He's been implanting things in his body. He's been planting things like metal connectors in his fingers so he can bridge electrical circuit as he touches things. This is Professor Herr at MIT, unfortunately had a very tragic climbing accident, but he has these prostheses that allows him to walk and be extremely balanced. You can't tell. He can walk and stand and run with these very sophisticated prostheses which use control theory to balance perfectly as he's using them. A few people have had invasive sensors into their brain where they can actually think and move cursors on a mouse. And this is done using this thing called a Utah array, which is a 10 by 10 set of electrodes. And over at Stanford, they've actually done invasive connections into a monkey's scalp, so they can detect the electrical impulses in various neurons in various places. And then we use this mathematical neural network to see what those impulses sense, and they're able to actually sense where the fingers are moving. And you can actually do this. I'll leave this up. You can look this up and send the slides. They've actually sort of played a little game where the monkey's hands are clamped, and they've trained the monkey with juice to move the cursor as the cursor moves from letter to letter. And they've set up a little demonstration where they pre-set up ahead of time to type to be or not to be in Shakespeare. Another example, sometimes when people have epilepsy, they go through brain surgery. Again, they have these sensors that sense the nerves and they make people think 0 to 9. And again, just by thinking, we can actually understand what they're saying in very limited sense. But it's amazing how good the quality is of the speech, given that the people are not actually speaking. So can a machine have a mind? We talk about strong AI consciousness. Can we actually simulate weak intelligence, which we do right now, but can we have really strong AI with humans? And the poster child for this is HAL, which is in the movie 2001 A Space Odyssey, which is about 53 years old now, this movie. And in that movie, the computer actually took over the spaceship to the chagrin of the astronauts. And HAL was particularly clever because it could also lip read, not just lip read directly, but lip read at a 45-degree angle, which is extremely difficult. It's well known that lip reading will improve the performance of speech recognition, despite not being used in a very prevalent manner today. But they could basically take over the machine, thought for itself. So people think, well, what is consciousness? And lots of disciplines, philosophers spent a lot of work on it. Some people think the reason it is so difficult to define is it's like time and space. It's just a fundamental. Other people think it's really just a side effect of what the brain is. There may be correlates in the brain, but they're not actually real consciousness. Searle said, John Searle at Berkeley, he talks about the Chinese room experiment. He says, well, a machine can't possibly have a real mind. And the example is, let's say you're stuck in a Chinese room, and someone's handing you Chinese characters, and your job is to translate those Chinese characters to another set of Chinese characters by a set of rules. Those of you who may know that the character set in Hong Kong is different to the character set in mainland China. Maybe you may be given that problem. And when you rewrite these characters, are you actually doing any thinking? And he would say, well, you're actually not doing any thinking. Other people say, well, the rule book itself, by definition, is quite complex, and you are doing some thinking. Also, people have, this concept started to lose its force. We talk about compact discs and streaming and a vinyl record. We're now getting copies of things that you can actually do. So you may not need to actually have an exact copy of the brain to actually simulate the brain. So this is what the philosophers talk about. And I say this as a computer scientist. I'm not a philosopher, so some of you may be, and have a much more virulent debate on this. Roger Penrose at Oxford, he talks about the quantum forces in the brain that can actually create forces of what is consciousness, or maybe concepts such as love at first sight. These are forces that people are communicating with each other. Again, people might say, well, quantum theory is even more difficult than explaining consciousness. So really, are we really simplifying the explanation? Francis Crick, Cambridge, in his last pieces of work, he decided after DNA to work on the brain. He published this book in the sort of late 80s, early 80s actually. And many people in religion said, finally, the scientists are looking, studying the soul. What is the soul? But it turned out the book was mainly opposite to that. He said, really, we're just a bag of chemicals, no more than a vast assembly of nerve cells. And so people are trying to look for what consciousness is. Can you actually use something called trace conditioning? Give an electric shock and then see what the person does. And use MRIs to do that. Christoph Koch, who's at Seattle, in the Seattle Institute, Alan in Seattle Institute, follows this area onwards from Francis Crick to saying what parts of the brain could actually be dealt with this. Stanislas Dehaene, he talks there's three types of consciousness. The subconscious that just works automatically. We start breathing, we start drinking without even thinking about it, and we can drive a car eventually subconsciously. Then consciousness one, where we have lots of sort of concepts appearing all at the same time, we choose the right ones. And consciousness two, where we take aspects from the outside to build what we're actually really thinking and what we're really believing. And the mathematical equivalent to attempt to try and do this is something called PathNet. We have lots of mini neural networks around, and we use a master neural network to choose which network we should use. We've all heard of the Turing test. Maybe this is a Turing test. This is a chat bot that you ask, and your task is to figure out whether the outside is a human or not. And the consciousness test will have to be completely different because that really just is looking at not really consciousness, but simply does it pass for human, which is sort of a lower threshold. Consciousness, we have to ask questions of concepts like life after death or ghosts, which are more difficult to understand. Something like talking about music to a deaf person or color to a blind person. We have to have those kinds of questions. And we'd have to probe questions like ethics. And people think about then, can we upload a brain into a machine? Can we actually, if we looked at every single neuron and create a simulation of it, can we actually create a replica? And here again, the philosophers have sort of come to bring to bear their views. You can imagine deep brain stimulation, which is used for Parkinson's, where there's a little electrical impulse or light that goes into the brain that helps the Parkinson's treatment. And imagine that happens. And at the beginning, you can say, well, 0.1% of our brain is changed. And then we do something else, a cochlear implant, maybe 1%'s changed. Maybe eventually we get 50% of our brain changed. Are we still the same person? And this goes back to Hobbes, who talked about the ship of Theseus in the mid-1800s, where the ship was docking into port and it's been repaired every time it docked. But the planks, as it's been repaired, were saved, and the planks were then used to rebuild the ship. Then which ship is original? And we say, well, if we keep the original planks, if you do model cars, classic car collector, if you have the VIN number, it's the same. The analogy for us is if we have the brain is the same, our DNA is the same, can we, we are the original person. Can we implement emotions in computers? Things like guilt or envy. Certainly we can detect smiles, we detect sadness. If you go to trade shows, people have sort of got cameras that detect these. They're even sort of more as we're bumping into the ethics barrier. Some controversy recently, there's a paper that said we can detect if you're going to be a criminal purely from the picture of your face. Many scientists are objecting to that. The cause and effect we think is not there. This is Paro, where we can actually give emotions a $6,000 item, and it sort of purrs and things, and it can actually do things. And so this is the long bet that we can actually do. Can you actually detect? Now, when can a machine be truly aware by 2015? You go to this site, and any of you can sort of think about when that would be available. I will stop there for a second. There was one slide on, a couple of slides on AI for mental health. We've used it in many areas. Maybe we'll just cover this in a couple of minutes. Very debilitating disease, many companies working on it. You can do things like gait analysis, measuring how you walk. You can do things like there's a chatbots to detect suicidal thoughts, fast speech, detect new speech recognition. And depression is not well understood. Usually it's questionnaires, and can we actually find things through brain imaging? That's usually not as popular. And looking at texts, the crisis text line, 30 million texts, and being able to give personalized dosing for such things. I'll stop there. I give a lot of other talks. These are some for the next few weeks.